So the gospel reading I've chosen today is from John chapter 16. And it's Jesus has less than 24 hours to live. It's the famous Last Supper. And in John's gospel, John devotes about 5 chapters to what Jesus was teaching them in the last few moments of his teaching life. A woman giving birth to a child has pain because her time has come. But when her baby is born, she forgets the anguish because of her joy that a child is born into the world. So, with you. Now is your time of grief, but I will see you again, and you will rejoice, and no one will take away your joy. In that day, you will no longer ask me anything. Very truly, I tell you, my Father will give you whatever you ask in my name. Until now, you have not asked for anything in my name. Ask, and you will receive, and your joy will be complete. Though I have been speaking figuratively, a time is coming when I will no longer use this kind of language, but I will tell you plainly about my Father. In that day, you will ask in my name. I am not saying that I will ask the Father on your behalf. No, the Father himself loves you because you have loved me and have believed that I came from God. I came from the Father and entered the world. And now I am leaving the world and going back to the Father. Then Jesus' disciples said, now you are speaking clearly and without figures of speech. Now we can see that you know all things and that you do not even need to have anyone ask you questions. This makes us believe that you came from God. Do you believe? Jesus replied, a time is coming, and in fact, has already come, when you will be scattered, each to your own home. You will leave me all alone. Yet I am not alone, for my Father is with me. I have told you these things so that you may have peace. In this world, you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world. Words inspired by God. A few weeks ago, I was having an email correspondence with a friend of ours, and he had just finished reading the book, Setting God Free, in which I made the claim, having done a lot of research, that Moses is probably the most important liberator that never actually lived, that he was a fiction created at a time in Jewish history when they needed a hero figure, but that this archetype of Moses has inspired countless millions of people throughout the ages. And so in this exchange, my friend asked me, he said, can you explain then to me why Jesus speaks about Moses? If Moses is a fictitious character, why did Jesus base, the Paschal mystery and the Eucharist, on what Moses had done 1,250 years before that? And so I promised him I'd take up that theme. And that's the theme I want to address for the month of August. As you know, typically the first Sunday, I'll talk about the theme. The second Sunday, I will develop it further. Then the third Sunday, I'll do a recap and a Q&A. And so today I want to introduce this topic. And I'm going to he asked about the notion of typologies or archetypes. And so if I were to give this theme a name, I would call it Archetypes as the Blueprints for Incarnation. And so this morning I want to make 3 points, and then next Sunday I'll continue on. So this morning I want to talk about, I want to distinguish between archetypes and complexes. And then secondly, I want to talk about what is the purpose of the archetype. And then I'm going to end by taking one very important archetype. I call it blood, the archetype of life. And I want to develop that. And then next Sunday, God willing, I'll pick up on the question, what then is the difference between Moses and Jesus when they're talking about the archetype of blood? So let me then firstly distinguish between what an archetype is and what a complex is. If you read Plato, Plato has this extraordinary notion of what he calls the ideal form. And there's a difference between the ideal form and the imperfect representation of it. And so an archetype is the ideal form, whereas a complex, and I'll tell you what it is in a few moments, a complex is the flawed product. So there's a big difference between an archetype and a complex, but they're very, very closely interrelated. So the archetype is the ideal form, and the complex is the flawed product. And so if I were to use a few kind of analogies, I would say that an archetype is to a complex as a gene is to an organism. And so the archetype is the organizing code. The gene is an organizing code that creates an organism. Or I would say that an archetype is to a complex as a meme is to a culture. A culture is composed and organized by particular motifs and stories, and they're called memes. And so the difference between an archetype, and a complex is the difference between a meme and the culture that it gives birth to. Or I might say that an archetype is to a complex as the nucleus is to the atom. So the nucleus is the center that holds all the electrons together. And so that's the difference between an archetype and a complex. Or another example, I would say that an archetype is to a complex as a blueprint is to the physical building. So you take your blueprint, you give it to your builder, he reads this, and he creates a physical dwelling for you. So that's kind of the difference between an archetype and a complex. So I'll give you a few examples from kind of real life. When you do geometry, you know, for instance, that there's an ideal circle. There's an ideal, perfectly round circle, and a circle is defined by the fact that every point on the perimeter is equidistant from the center. No matter where you go on the perimeter, it's exactly the same distance into the center. So that's the ideal form. That's the archetype of a circle. But then try drawing a circle. Take a piece of paper and start trying to draw a circle. It is less than perfect. Even if you take a protractor and a compass and you describe a circle on a page, it still will not be perfect, because there'll be micromuscular movements in your hand, and then there'll be a paper, and the paper is furrowed in some way. So you're never going to get a perfect representation of the ideal circle. So one is an archetype, the ideal form, and the other is the circle you actually produce. Or to use biology, DNA is like the archetype. To build a human being, you need the genetic code we call the DNA, and that's the ideal. And so this genetic code, this archetype, creates 8 billion human beings on the planet right now. Now, there's a different archetype that creates kitty cats on the planet. I don't know how many billion of kitty cats there are, but they're all coming from this one archetype of what kittenhood looks like. Now, the interesting thing is humans and kitty cats are made of the same stuff. Basically carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen. But it's the codification that creates human beings or kitty cats. So in some senses, that DNA or that coding is like the archetype. And then the individuals, species like humans or kitty cats are kind of the product of that. So when you even look at human beings as a group, every one of us is built according to the archetype, and still every single one of us is going to be different. And so that's the complex piece of it. And then in psychology, to use an example from psychology, every single little infant is born with the archetype of mother emblazoned in its psyche. It knows to expect a mother when it comes down. So that's what's meant by the mother archetype. Every single neonate knows there's going to be a mother with these particular kinds of parts. There'll be a breast, there'll be a nipple, there'll be milk, there'll be cuddling, there'll be comfort, there'll be words of joy and ecstasy. And so in some senses, every little neonate is born with the archetype of mother emblazoned on its psyche. But then there's what's called the mother complex. And most people misunderstand what the word complex means. If you say somebody has a mother complex, you think, oh, he's got a hang up around his mother. That is not what a complex means. A complex literally means the aggregation of associated experiences around the actual woman he's going to meet. So the baby comes in with the archetype of mother, knowing exactly what to expect. But every mother is going to be very, very different. And so the child now is going to build a complex based on the actual experiences he's going to have around the archetype of the woman he was expecting. And now that complex can be really good. She can be a really, really great mother, or it can be a neglectful person. So the complex is the kind of the aggregate of associated experiences built around the archetype of the mother the child came in to expect. And so that's the difference then between the archetype and the complex. The complex is not necessarily a hang-up. It's merely the cluster of emotionally charged experiences that the neonate is having around the archetype of mother with which it came in. So that is basically, it's very important to understand that difference then between the ideal form and the manifest form. So what then is the purpose of the archetype? So the purpose of the archetype is to show the ideal form in order to inspire imitation of the ideal form. The archetype of this circle is to inspire you to draw better and better circles. The archetype of the mother is to inspire you to be a more and more loving, compassionate woman to your child. And so the archetype always precedes the manifestation. First comes the archetype and then the manifestation of it. Now, the same is true throughout. If you want to do good ritual, for instance, for liturgy, or you want to kind of build a culture from teachings or from stories, in some senses, it doesn't matter whether the archetype is fictional or factual, as long as it's inspirational. The importance of the archetype is that it is an inspiration. And whether the archetype is based on a historical person or a fictitious character really doesn't make any difference, as long as it's inspirational. And I will develop that next week, God willing, as I talk about Moses and Jesus. You know, why did Jesus refer to Moses if Moses never existed? And what I'm going to claim is that it's the archetype of the liberator that Jesus is going back to. And whether Moses existed historically or as a fictional character that needed to be created in order to inspire the Jews in a real crisis, it doesn't really matter. The function of the archetype is to inspire. Now, the archetype then, when we think about our individual incarnation, the archetype is the ideal mission implanted in the soul. So when you and I volunteer for incarnation, there's an ideal imprint of the mission, what you've come down here to do. And that archetype is imprinted on your individual soul. Now, the complex then is the incarnated version of that mission. And so as you've lived your life, if you've been aligned with the mission, it's going to look one way. If you're misaligned from the mission, it's going to look very different. So the complex then is how you're actually living out your mission in life. And it parallels what I've said many, many times. It's like it parallels the difference and the split between the ideals and the values. The ideals are the archetypes that are meant to drive your mission. And the values are the compromises each of us makes with those archetypes and those ideals because of life circumstances. So that would be the complex. So even in your own life, you're dancing between the archetype of your mission and the complex of your mission. So let me pick up on one important archetype then. And I'm going to develop this next week, talking about Moses and Jesus. So this one I'm going to call the archetype of blood. Blood is the archetype of life, I'm totally convinced. If you could take any one kind of symbol that is archetypal of life, it would be blood. So I'll give you a bunch of examples from different kind of historical periods. And firstly, to say that a woman's menstrual cycle, her ability to conceive and carry and nurture and birth life, is an archetype of life. And so the very blood flow itself, that blood is the archetype of the life she's capable of conceiving and carrying, and nurturing and giving birth to. So that would be like the female version of the archetype where blood signifies life. For the males among us, it is the warrior who's prepared either to shed his own blood or to shed the blood of others, to take the life of the enemy or to give his own life in order to kind of give life to the tribe. So right there again, you have blood as an archetype of life, a kind of a male version and a female version. Now, in all ancient traditions, blood, which is the stuff of life, very definitely belongs to God. And so there's going to be lots of teachings around blood and blood sacrifice and the importance of blood in ritual. So I'm convinced that at a very, very early stage of human evolution, maybe going back 200,000 years, long before maybe Homo sapiens, when we were still just Homo sapiens. At that stage, I think it's possible that these nomadic tribes people did not make the connection between coition and conception. They didn't make that kind of a connection for a period of time. That dawned on them gradually by watching what happened. And so the belief system was that since every baby was born in blood and it was a very painful exercise for the mother, then somehow the belief system was that the women were stealing children from the gods. And it came in blood and it came with pain. And so many, many different traditions, you had to buy back the firstborn. It's called redemption. The word redemption in Latin, redemptio, literally means to buy back. This creature belonged to God, and now this woman stole it, and it's covered in blood, and the God's going to be angry, and so we need to redeem this child in some way. And so in many, many systems, they sacrificed the firstborn child. The belief system was that eventually that, it is God who impregnates the woman for the first time. So God opens the womb is the phrase that is being used. Subsequently, any male of the tribe can now impregnate the woman. But initially, only God opened the womb and only God gave birth to the firstborn. And so the firstborn needed to go back because it believed it belonged to God. And then at some stage you have, if you go, for instance, to Genesis chapter 6, a notion that the gods themselves were having intercourse with human women. It says, the sons of God found the daughters of men to be very attractive, and they took them to wife as many as they wanted to, and they created the race of giants, which is called the Nephilim in the Bible. And so you have this notion of blood being the source of life and belonging to God. Now, one of the most ancient civilization on the planet as far as the living literature is concerned, is the Sumerians from the Middle East. So the Sumerians in their copious writings said that a group of god figures from a planet called Nibiru, and the beings are called the Anunnaki, that the Anunnaki created human beings, not from scratch, but that they took an existing primate class on planet Earth. They mixed the clay of the earth with the blood of the gods, their own DNA, and then they had Anunnaki females who volunteered their wombs, and they implanted this mixture of God DNA and primate DNA. They implanted in the wombs of these Anunnaki volunteers. So you had a donor sperm and you had a donor womb. So you're talking about in vitro fertilization. And this is stuff that was written over 5,000 years ago. Now, at one stage, the Anunnaki decided to upgrade human beings, because initially humans were only conceived in Anunnaki wombs from donations from males on planet Earth and from the male gods, male Anunnaki gods. Now they began to upgrade human beings. So for the first time ever, human beings could breed on their own, that a man and a woman could get together and they could conceive a child. But that was a subsequent stage of the upgrading of humans, according to the Anunnaki. Now, the Hebrews and the Hebrew scriptures have borrowed a lot of their stories, the creation stories, the flood stories, many of these from the ancient Sumerians. So where did the Hebrews take it? So for instance, in Hebrew, the word Adam comes from the word Adamah, which in Hebrew means soil or earth, but not just any kind of soil or earth. Adamah literally means dark red soil. And interesting, the word for blood in Hebrew is Adom. And so now you have a triple pun. When you read about God created Adam, Adam means an earthling, is from the earth, is created from the earth, or one made of dark red soil, blood, or a creature made of blood. And so you're punning in the original Hebrew when you talk about the creation of the first human being, Adam. And the creation of the first female, Chava in Hebrew, is from the Hebrew word chai, which means life. And so in some senses, the male creates the container and the female creates, the spirit in some ways. Now, we had the very same thing in Swahili. The word for a human being in Swahili is binadamu. Binadamu means a human being. Now, bin, the same in Swahili and in Arabic, means son of. And Adam, so we're talking binadamu literally means the son of Adam, or a human being. But in Swahili as well, the word for blood is damu. So you get this very same pun between earth and blood. So binadamu in Swahili can mean a human being, or it can mean the son of Adam, or it can mean an earthling, or it can mean a bloodling, a creature of blood. Now, interesting in the Hebrew version as well, that we are told that God fashioned human beings from the clay of the earth, from this red earth. And then he breathed into it. And the word that's used in Hebrew is nephesh. And nephesh means a soul or a spirit. So he impregnated this creature he had fashioned with a soul or a spirit. And then it's built in the image of likeness of God. But very, very soon, you have these ancient peoples, they're sacrificing their kids to the gods. So there was one famous god who was a real bloodthirsty character, a guy called Moloch. Now, Moloch, there's a dispute between the experts whether he was an earlier version of Yahweh or whether he was a Canaanite god, but he demanded child sacrifice. The idea being, of course, that, blood was God's, and any creature born through blood belongs to God and he wants it back. Now, you get that story still in the Hebrew scriptures. In Genesis chapter 22, you have this terrible story where Abraham God told Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac. And he takes him out and he builds an altar and he binds him and he puts him on the altar and he takes out his dagger and he's about to kill the child. So it's like God is still demanding human sacrifice. Now, there's a different ending to that story that I'll mention to you. So how did peoples begin to deal with this? How are you going to procreate, and have surviving children if you keep having to sacrifice them back to God because they belong to God? So they came up with techniques for fooling the gods. And so one version of that was, if a woman had the chutzpah to deliver twins, then God was going to be really, really, really upset. Bad enough that you stole one child from God, now you're stealing two at the same time. And so the custom was, you took one of the children to a crossroads and you deposited the neonate at a crossroads and you went home with the second one. And you were hoping that God wouldn't notice that you'd stolen two kids. And when he came to take back the kids, he'd think he was only one. And so he took the one that was at the crossroads and then you could keep the second one. A second way of dealing with was the notion of changing a child's name. There's a Hebrew tradition around Lilith. Lilith was actually Adam's first wife. When you read through the ancient Jewish mythology, Adam had a wife before Eve came along, and she was called Lilith. But they didn't get on very, very well. She ran away from him. But then she started being problematic, and she was killing children. And so in order to prevent Lilith from killing children, they would change the child's name. They'd give the child a name, a kind of a ceremonial naming of the child, and then very quickly they changed the name. So when Lilith came to kill the child, she got mixed up because the name child was no longer there. Now, interesting, in Celtic Ireland, and right up to the time, shortly before I was born in the 1940s, there was a custom in Ireland. Then a little boy was dressed like a girl for the first 7 years of his life, complete in a dress for the first 7 years. And the belief system was, in our case, that it prevented the fairies from stealing the child, the boy child. We have a word in Gaelic called a shiafra, which means a changeling, where the fairies come and they steal a human baby and put a lookalike in its place. And so to prevent that from happening, they would dress little boys in girls' clothes for the first 7 years. So the notion of fooling the gods in order to be able to retain your children was one way in which they dealt with the notion that blood belonged to God and therefore children born in blood belonged to God. Let me switch right across now the globe to the New World and look at what that custom looked like, in Mesoamerica. So, for instance, among the Aztecs priests used razor-sharp obsidian blades to slice open the chest of sacrificial victims and offer their still-beating hearts to the gods. They would slit the chest, pull out the beating heart, and offer it to the gods. In fact, in one famous inauguration of the Templo Mayo, 80,400 men, women, and children were sacrificed to the sun god. Now, these human sacrifices could be made throughout the year to coincide with important calendar dates, or for the dedication of temples, or in the case of a drought or a famine. So for the Aztecs, it was a matter of survival, because According to Aztec cosmology, the sun god was waging a constant war against the god of darkness. And if the god of darkness won, the world would end. And so to keep the sun moving across the sky and therefore to preserve their lives, the Aztecs had to constantly feed the sun god with human hearts and human blood. And the interesting thing is that many victims went willingly to the sacrificial altar, because to give your heart to the sun god was like a tremendous honor, and it guaranteed you had a ticket to the blessed afterlife, where now you were a member of the sun god's army fighting the darkness. And it's interesting that came down into modern times in Islamic teaching. You have this notion that the shaheed, shaheed is an Aramaic word, an Arabic word. It's also a Swahili word for a witness, or a martyr. The notion that if you give your life for the cause or for Islam, then you get heaven when you die, and you get 72 virgins. So this notion again of this sacrificial blood goes right through human history. Now, at some stage of human history, we began to toy with the idea that perhaps we could fool the gods, or we could placate the gods in a different fashion, maybe by substituting animal sacrifice for human sacrifice. And so again and again and again throughout human culture and throughout human religions, you get this notion that you can actually substitute an animal, kill an animal instead of killing a human being. And that's the end of the story in Genesis chapter 22. When God had commanded Abraham to kill his own son, Isaac, and he's prepared to, he's about to kill the child with a dagger, and God says, stop. He sends an angel to stop his hand. And he says, look behind you, and there's a ram caught in the thicket by its horns. And he says, sacrifice the ram. I'll be happy with an animal instead of your son. So this notion now, of substituting animal sacrifice for human sacrifice. Now, as I look as a psychologist through what it says in the Tanakh about this change of mind that God had, I get the impression that where God sacrificed humans, it was to assuage God's anger. Every time God sacrificing human beings, and he did it by the millions, it was always because the God was angry about something. Now with animal sacrifice, it's almost like a form of non-stop snacking on God's behalf. We are told he loved the smell of roasting flesh. We're literally told that in the scriptures. So it's almost like this is God's kind of breakfast and lunch and dinner, animal sacrifice. And so there's this mandated non-stop ritual animal sacrifice of birds, goats, sheep, and cattle on the following occasions, for instance. According to the injunctions in the Tanakh, you're meant to do animal sacrifice every morning, every evening, every Sabbath, on the New Moon Festival, at Passover, at Pentecost, on New Year's Day, on the Day of Atonement, and on the Feast of Booths. He was a mighty, bloody God. May he rest in peace. Namaste.